Hi, my name is Paul Mazourek, and I'm the museum curator for the city of Whyalla in South Australia. And this National Reconciliation Week 2021 presentation explores the relationship between the First People and the ancient country in Whyalla's wider region. From the times of the oldest confirmed human presence in this part of South Australia until the Europeans' arrival, this landscape underwent considerable evolution. People who witnessed these environmental changes had to adapt in order to survive. This is a story of change, survival, and new opportunities based on the factual events. So let's start. The area of interest is the land south of Lake Torrens towards Port Augusta, then continuing to the northern section of Spencer Gulf, further continuation of the area in the further southern direction towards Whyalla and beyond, including Point Lowly Peninsula and Cowell, and the land southwest of Port Augusta towards Gawler Ranges. The actual time of interest is a quaternary period, which is in fact the last 2.5 million years. This is divided into basically two time change. The first one is called Pleistocene, which started 2.5 million years ago and lasted until 10,000 years ago, and we had 20 major ice ages. The second one is called Holocene, and it started 10,000 years ago, and it's continuing until today. And this is basically a post-glacial warming and interglacial periods. The first people arrived in this region, specifically near Port Augusta and at Flinders Ranges, by the end of Pleistocene, 49,000 years ago, which is for Flinders Ranges, and 40,000 years ago, which is for Port Augusta. Today, we acknowledge these indigenous groups in the geographic area of interest, and they are Bangala, between Lake Torrens, Port Augusta, Whyalla, Point Lowly, Cowell, Gawler Ranges, and western shore of the northern Spencer Gulf. Then it's Nukunu, the eastern shore of the northern Spencer Gulf and the land expanding east. Another one is Andyamatana, people living in the Flinders Ranges to Port Augusta, visiting Point Lowly. Another people were Kokata, northwest of Gawler Ranges, close to Port Augusta and northwest of Whyalla. They possibly were visiting Point Lowly as well. And Wirangu, western neighbors of Bangala, possibly visiting Gawler Ranges as well. These hunter-gatherers experienced generally better conditions and different flora and fauna compared to today. However, the basic form of the landscape they walked through, which were plains and ranges, were already shaped in the form we are familiar with, except for the Spencer Gulf. The types of landscape in the area of interest are plateaus or high plains, which are mainly around Tent Hill region, north of Port Augusta and continuing to Point Lowly. Then it is so-called fold mountain ranges, and they are situated north of Whyalla and then south in the Whyalla direction. Further, we have got peneplains, which are rolling or undulating plains cut in bedrock, which is otherwise known as Kimba Plain. Another one is granitic plains and isolated hills, also known as Inselberg landscape, and this is mainly Fitzgerald Bay to Point Douglas. And last, coastal plains from Port Augusta to Whyalla and continuing to Cowell. Tent Hill and Pandura Range plains and Long Sleep Plain north of Whyalla developed 20 million years ago. Silkreed in this area formed about 20,000 years ago. Why we mention silkreed is that the Aboriginal people were known to mine silkreed for their own purpose. And silkreed is an erosion-resistant material. It was probably originally deposited in water as silica gel. Shingle beach deposits between Point Douglas and Fitzgerald Bay formed 30,000 years ago. The inland sand dunes were formed between 10,000 years ago and 30,000 years ago. Most of the beach, sand, mangrove, samphire, and supratidal sediments we know today have formed within the last 6,500 years. The most common soils of the region are red duplex soils, and they are either desert loams or red-brown earth. The today's Spencer Gulf Basin was intermittently changing its appearance from a long, almost dry valley to a half-flooded gulf and otherwise. 140,000 years ago, the Gulf was almost completely dry. Then 120,000 years ago, it was full again and at today's level. After that, it fluctuated into about 60% capacity at 40,000 years ago and reached almost dry conditions 20,000 years ago. Since then, the waters were steadily rising to the present level, peaking at about 6,000 years ago. When flooded, the submerged areas included also low-lying sections of the land stretching from False Bay towards Lincoln Gap. The only significant freshwater inland river from the late Pleistocene was most probably the Mile Creek, which pronounced bed is still visible today. The creek expands into a Tregelana salt lake 20 km north of Whyalla. As per archaeological evidence, the first people tend to stay close to Port Augusta and within Flinders Ranges, but they must have explored land immediate south as well. That means Point Lowly and Whyalla's wider region in general, and later on, as supported by an actual Dreamtime story, they witnessed the flooding of the Gulf themselves. These first people also encountered and hunted the megafauna animals, which could include Dendrolagus nolbano, Diprotodon optatum, Geniornis newtoni, Procoptodon gili, Protemnodon tumbuna, Protemnodon brihus, Protemnodon hopei, Protemnodon nombei, Stenorus andersoni, Simostenorus occidentalis, Protemnodon anac, Simostenorus pales, and Thylocolio chemifex. These were mainly large kangaroos and wombat-like and emus-like animals. Major loss of Australian megafauna happened between 50,000 years ago and 45,000 years ago. Most extinct species were those exceeding 100 kilos, including half of those animals weighing between 10 kilos and 100 kilos. Evidence at Port Augusta human habitation site, just north of Port Augusta, suggests evidence of human megafaunal predation, and it was the remnants of Geniornis newtoni, which was a big emu-like bird. Not all megafauna went extinct. Some underwent dwarfing, others survived relatively unchanged, such as emus, cassowaries, wombats, saltwater crocodiles, and many species of large kangaroos. In terms of these animals that survived and dwarfed in this area of interest, we talk mainly about emus, wombats, and large kangaroos. For example, Bangala mythology includes the story of Kupiri, that was a large red kangaroo. The symbols depicted at the Tregelana cave just north of Whyalla are of serpent, emu, and human footprints, among others. Stories of those sometimes dangerous encounters were passed on generations and may have become part of Dreamtime mythology. The megafauna did extinct only about 39,000 years ago, and the people were already here. The climate change brought modifications to the weather patterns and consequently to the landscape, which influenced human behavior for years to come. The end of Pleistocene and beginning of Holocene, which is 10,000 years ago, is the time of the end of the last ice age, and this is very important. General warming, dry conditions inland caused aridification of the interior and a major rise of the ocean levels. The Spencer Gulf got flooded to today's level 6,000 years ago, and generations of people already living here witnessed this major change from the banks of Point Lowly and across the Gulf. The known elevated major camps were discovered at Point Lowly and Whyalla area. People adapted to dry conditions by changing their travel patterns and hunting techniques and started to utilize the new marine environment. Fishing brought in important change in diet. Increasingly hot summers draw people from inland towards the coastal areas, while winter chills and strong cold southerly winds reverse that pattern and people turn back towards the inland areas. So 11,000 years ago and 7,000 years ago, the hunters-gatherers were severely disrupted by climate fluctuations during the late Pleistocene, with a population slow and isolated until early Holocene. For example, the average rainfall in the area of interest today is between 100 and 200 millimeters a year. However, the Whyalla region receives more rainfall in summer than in winter compared to the west coast of Eyre Peninsula. There are no permanent creeks or rivers here, no lakes, and those lakes that are still here are salt lakes only. The natural rainwater catchments occur in the rocks crevices, and the underground freshwater salinity is over 12,000 milligrams per liter, which is enormous. The known freshwater springs are located at Point Lowly and Hammock Hill. 6,000 years ago until 4,000 years ago, people were becoming more sedentary. Regional populations appeared to become more established and showed long-term, frequent and repeat usage of the same area. At the same time, there was an increase and greater exploitation of marine resources, including usage of fish traps and swamp management. 4,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago, there was, in general, significant decline in rainfall. The reactivation of interior sand dunes started again. Wind caused sheet erosion of topsoil. The combination of wind and subsequent intermittent rainfalls created deep incisions into the hillsides, leading to scalding, which is a removal of topsoil, exposing the clay subsoil. And this eventually led to a decrease of the natural vegetation regrowth and general further expansion of arid landscape. 4,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago, the aridification of the country placed stress on existing populations, although mobility didn't increase dramatically, but rather sedentary and technological behavior intensified. Bangala people were known to spend 6 to 7 hours hunting and gathering in order to satisfy their needs, even in the harshest environment. The estimate of their travel was between 25 kilometers to 30 kilometers per day. As per their food resources, one of the main ones, red kangaroos, they can travel up to 100 kilometers in search for water in this environment. People's general response to the environmental changes in the landscape was, first, decline in population, second, broadening of diet, third, investment in procurement and new techniques in productive habitats, and this is very important for development. The fourth, abandonment of marginal areas, and fifth, some territorial expansion. It is an estimate that before the European settlement, the overall indigenous population of the Eyre Peninsula accounted for about 2,000 people. With the landmass of 170,500 square kilometers, it means that there were 0.01 people per square kilometer. The South Australian Territory, as we know it today, accommodated only between 4 to 4.8% of the total pre-European Australian population. In 2011, the overall Eyre Peninsula population was 58,700, which is still only 0.3 people per square kilometer. It is due to the late Pleistocene climate change that brought arid conditions and along with major lack of freshwater resources, that the land conditions could not be reversed even with the help of the modern 21st century technology. So, in conclusion, the first people arrived, they hunted megafauna, they witnessed fluctuations of the Gulf waters, creation of shingle beach deposits, changes of Tent Hills and Pandura Range over the surrounding plains, formations and deformations of the inland sand dunes, and most importantly, they watched the final filling up of the Gulf. They developed new technologies and utilized available marine flora and fauna food sources and survived. Thank you.